Okay, thank you, Jody. Welcome, everyone, to the April 17th, 2023 Board of Trustees meeting. We are beginning our meeting tonight a few minutes late due to technology problems with Zoom, so we're starting at 7:34. Thanks, everyone, for attending. My first order of business is to call our roll, so I'll start with Carolyn Greenwald.
Here.
Drew Riedel.
Present.
Susan Ainsley.
Present.
Pat O'Rourke.
Present.
And Ronnie Hardaway is present also, so we're all here. Thank you for attending. I would move to open our public comment period. Need a second?
Second.
Second. All those in favor? Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Okay, public comment. We have some public in the audience tonight. If you would like to speak, just raise your voice. Nothing? Anyone online? Hearing none, seeing none, I will move that we close our public comment period.
Second.
2 seconds. All those in favor, say aye.
Aye. There'll be competition here.
Catch a breath, catch a breath, and we'll move on. Okay, we have a minute to approve.
That shows there's 2 people in the waiting room. Thank you.
Still 2? Okay, thank you.
Because I was wondering why there's nobody here from the Board of Trust, the planning board. Still not. Okay.
Okay, all right. So we had Jody sent us the minutes from our last meeting.
From Monday, April 3rd.
Monday, April 3rd. So did anyone have comments about those minutes? I will move that we approve the draft minutes as our final minutes. Need a second?
Second.
Susan seconds. All those in favor say aye.
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 Aye. Okay, we have 1 minute approved. Next minute. Yeah, this is going to be a long meeting. So the next order of business tonight is to consider a change order number 1 for the sanitary sewer benefit area expansion project. It's a decrease in the contract of $882.27. According to John, the pumps we were going to originally purchase, that we plan on purchasing for this project, were not going to arrive on time, so the contractor recommended a different manufacturer of pumps with a very good history of excellent pumps, but the price is much lower in this case, and it actually allowed us to buy the pumps we planned for, plus a spare to be stored in our garage, and still have a decrease in the total amount of $882.27. So that's what we're voting on tonight. And I will move that we accept this change order number 1.
Second.
Susan seconds. Thank you, Susan. Any discussion about that? Okay. All those in favor of approving change order number 1 for $882.27, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. It's approved. Thank you. Okay, our next order of business is a presentation by Dr. Willison from Cornell. Drew, since you started this process, and I appreciate that, would you mind introducing Dr. Willison?
Sure, my pleasure. So our guest tonight, warm welcome to Dr. Charlie Willison, who is an assistant professor of public health at Cornell University. The trustees invited Dr. Willison to learn more about potential policy options in managing the complex issue of homelessness, which the village isn't immune. And we're grateful that she agreed to discuss the issue in person. As a political scientist, Dr. Wilson's research focuses on practical policies amidst a fragmented governance structure with various layers of local, state, federal oversight, and nonprofits, et cetera. And, excuse me, public health, political decision-making primarily focused on homelessness. She is the author of Ungoverned and Out of Sight, Public Health and the Political Crisis of Homelessness in the U.S., which analyzes the relationship between chronic homelessness and local governance. The book won the 2021 Dennis Judd Award for Best Book in Urban Politics. And our dialogue tonight with Dr. Wilson will be roughly 20-minute presentation followed by a 10-minute Q&A roughly at the end. And we'll be discussing who's in charge of various aspects of homelessness, who the homelessness are, what remedies might be, success stories, roadblocks, and potential policy benefits all in 20 minutes. So good luck. But having said that, she has a slide deck to present, and we really appreciate you coming out here and discussing this, just getting the ball rolling and discussing this issue and thinking about this issue. So thank you again for attending our village meeting tonight, Dr. Willison.
You're welcome, Dr. Wilson.
Thank you. Is this a good spot for me? Or where should I put this?
That's perfect.
Question, how can I get there? Because I can't minimize my screen because I'm recording.
Let me see here.
Because I did share screen.
Your screen,
Yeah, I did that.
and you cannot minimize.
Nope.
It will not let you minimize. Okay, hang on a second.
You share documents, can you do that?
I've got it up, there it is.
Yeah. There we go.
All right, Jody.
Okay.
Oh, thank you, Ronnie.
Then you should,
It was just an experiment and it succeeded.
I think if you change view,
It's magic. It's magic.
Well, thank you all so much for having me today. Thank you for being here. And just, as Drew stated, I'll go through some of the high-level issues and then policy challenges related to homelessness, and then also some that I think are very specific to Lansing and to Tompkins County in general. That said, obviously, it's a really complicated topic. I think about this most of my time, so I'm happy to answer more specific questions afterwards. But again, I'll just kind of give you the big pieces of the story.
Thank you.
So if you want to go ahead and get started. So first, I just wanted to kind of give you a sense of the number of people who experience homelessness in the United States. So it is, unfortunately, the scope of homelessness is quite extreme. The United States has the highest rate of homelessness among all high-income countries. And just to give you context, I know there are lots of different numbers here, but millions of Americans experience homelessness on an annual basis, which is pretty staggering, right? When we think about different public health issues, we don't normally talk about homelessness, but unfortunately, it affects many, many, many different people, and depending on how you measure it, it's quite a substantial proportion of people who will, at some point over the course of a year, experience homelessness. And so you can see here, so the general number that we have that measures homelessness, and I won't go into the data or measurement issues here. We generally, we do something called a point-in-time count, which is on one night in January, right? When most people are indoors, we do a count, which is a good, it's a consistent measure, but it doesn't really give us the annual trend over the course of a year. If you look at other data about annual trends, this is where you get the millions of folks. So about 1 to 2 million people experience sheltered homelessness on an annual basis. That's people who are staying in homeless shelters. But then if you count in other ways, so looking at people who might be couch surfing, doubling up, experiencing unsheltered homelessness, this 3.5 million number, that's just for adults aged 18 to 25. Just that age group. It's really devastating. I always get just like, it's overwhelming. Again, thinking about the scope of the problem across the United States, but in communities, and really just in ways that we have trouble measuring, right? So it's a lot. You can move forward. So this is just a little bit of pre-post pandemic context, what's going on. Things changed a lot during the pandemic related to homelessness. Obviously, we had severe economic changes, that made a lot of people at risk of homelessness or experiencing housing insecurity. So people, whether it's job loss, things like this, people were put into situations. We saw a rise in homelessness during the pandemic. And I'm going to here just to talk about chronic homelessness really quickly, and then I'll come back to the definition later. But this is a group of people that has the highest needs, and we saw the biggest changes in relation to rates of homelessness over the course of the pandemic. Pre-pandemic, about 1 in 5 people of people experiencing homelessness were experiencing chronic homelessness. We saw this go up by almost 10% during the pandemic, and this was because shelters closed, people didn't have a place to go, and so here I really want to emphasize, we saw homelessness increase overall, but we really saw unsheltered homelessness increase. Unsheltered homelessness is mostly chronic or long-term homelessness, which I'll talk about momentarily. So that's where we've really seen the big shift. When the shelters closed, more people had to be outside, so we've seen an increase in visible homelessness, which manifests in different ways. And I'll hold on the next part and go ahead and move to the next slide. So I'll just give you an overview of the types of homelessness. I know I just mentioned chronic homelessness, but first, when we think about who experiences homelessness in the United States, there are lots of different categories. I know on the first slide, it included children, adults age 18 to 25 in that 3.5 million category. But we can also kind of think of this as 2 buckets, temporary homelessness and long-term or chronic homelessness. Temporary homelessness are the majority of people who experience homelessness in the United States, and this is what it sounds like. It's short-term homelessness, and the primary cause is people are housing insecure. They are unable to remain stably housed because of financial conditions, whether that's the cost of housing, or wages, some combination. Basically, the costs don't add up, people have to make trade-offs, and this risk, this financial uncertainty, makes it so they can't remain stably housed. Most of these folks are employed, so these are the working homeless. Again, so when we say temporary homeless, these are people who are often rehoused pretty quickly. So, they're working, right? They have money coming in, there's just some kind of trade-off where they can't make ends meet, they can't quite get there. This is obviously especially prevalent now with inflation, with housing costs going up. We're seeing more people experiencing temporary homelessness, or just kind of being on the brink of, they know they're at risk of experiencing homelessness, but it's like, what kind of other support systems do you have to reach into to make sure that you do remain stably housed? The other big group that we see in temporary homeless are families with children. Child homelessness, you saw on the first slide, is a really significant issue in the United States. I don't have these numbers for Tompkins County, but families with children, this is another group there are more rehousing opportunities. This is a group that's prioritized, but again, it's just one of these categories where people might experience homelessness for a couple of days. You might have to stay in a shelter, until you can get some either into temporary housing or some kind of financial buffer that allows you to move into a different type of housing that you can afford, or something like that. So this is the primary type. The next one, thank you for moving forward, is chronic homelessness. So this is what I said, there's this really big bump, like a dramatic increase in chronic homelessness during COVID because shelters closed. Chronic homelessness is the most visible type of homelessness. So this is probably what most people think about when they think about what is homelessness look like. So this is people who are oftentimes sleeping in unsheltered locations, like on the streets, in parks, in encampments. In Tompkins County, downtown, we have the Jungle, which is what the largest encampment is known as. So this is really visible, and it's long durations of homelessness. So this is people who are experiencing homelessness for 3 months or longer, or have experienced homelessness for 2 times or more during the period of a year. And the really important difference between temporary homelessness and long-term homelessness, temporary homelessness, again, people are working, they're able to basically to participate in daily life, right? Like we all do. Chronic homelessness, people have more challenges. So this is a group that has really high needs. They have really high complex medical needs. And it's this intersection or this overlap between medical needs, so physical conditions, physical medical conditions, and behavioral conditions. And behavioral conditions here I'm referring to either substance use disorders and or psychiatric disorders. So like severe mental illness, bipolar, schizophrenia. And the intersection of these things, so whereas people experiencing temporary homelessness, they are unable to remain stably housed because of financial reasons. Here, homelessness manifests because of this interaction between these really complicated medical needs and finances, right? So you can imagine a whole host of things. Veterans are, which I'll talk about momentarily, are one of the biggest cases of this. You have people who have maybe you can't get the healthcare that you need, whether it's, being able to get psychiatric care, whether it's, health insurance and health insurance costs, where you then have to make these trade-offs for your housing costs. So you can't work. This is a group where people are usually on, or are more likely to be on disability. So it's all of these more complicated needs that require a more complex solution, but also have more complex causes. This is also a group that is aging disproportionately. So when I say chronic homelessness, so obviously we saw an increase in this during COVID. Duration really matters. And there's this big risk here where temporary homelessness can turn into long-term homelessness if people aren't rehoused right away. And right, we can all imagine, if you're sleeping on the streets, it's really stressful. It's really stressful for your body. If you end up with a physical disability, you may end up with, obviously a mental health disorder just as a result of the stress. You may end up with a behavioral health disorder in order to cope with the stress and the realities of experiencing homelessness. So there is this kind of temporality that's really important to consider here, but essentially the longer people experience homelessness, the more likely they are to remain homeless. And so we're seeing this trajectory too, and this is the same thing in Monmouth County. A lot of the people who you see on the streets have been experiencing homelessness for a really long time, and then it just requires these bigger interventions to get people out of homelessness. Mortality and morbidity rates are really, really high for this group, and again, the duration really, really matters. So now we'll go into solutions. So temporary homelessness, the good thing is this is a little bit easier, right? Again, these are people who are just going around day to day. It's primarily a financial issue. So you just need to keep people housed. So that's the good thing. There are lots of different ways to do this. Obviously not saying that being able to implement these things is easy, but there's a wider range of options, related to affordability, everything from wages to, housing subsidies, all of this kind of stuff. And there are lots of benefits too, right? When people remain housed, they can keep their jobs, keep kids in school. It just makes everything easier, and it reduces the risk of long-term or chronic homelessness. So now chronic homelessness, as I mentioned, this one's more complicated. This is the one that requires more intense interventions. The good news though, and this I always think is really cool and I love talking about, we have a really outstanding amount of evidence about what works to end chronic homelessness. And this isn't like just from the United States. This is actually, at this point, I need to update this slide. We have over 4 decades of evidence from around the world about the efficacy of permanent supportive housing or housing first. And what this is because this is a group that has, they don't have housing. There's this financial element, but they also have these complex physical and some kind of behavioral health condition. They need supportive medical services at the same time. And if you give people both, if you basically house people and give them access to supportive medical services, the retention rate, the ability for people to remain stably housed is over 90%, 95% if it's done well. And this is in the long term. So it's incredibly successful, it's really effective, and there have been all these different randomized controlled trials from Canada to Australia to New York City to many, many different places. It's really impressive. It is also very cost effective, and I'm happy to, there's a whole lot of, I didn't put any links to this because there's like so much data on the cost effectiveness of housing first. I'll just say on average, it is about half the cost to house people in housing first compared to letting people remain chronically homeless. And this is because, again, this is a population that has such complicated needs, they're sometimes referred to as high utilizers of multiple systems, where, you have people moving in and out of emergency departments, in and out of jail, interacting with the police, encampment clearances. There are all of these different systems that are really expensive, right? Even if you just think about hospital beds on their own, these are really, really pricey things, but if you house people, it frees up space for all these other different resources. Police can do other things. There are more hospital beds, where, otherwise people are just there because they don't have a place to go. So it's great. And the cost savings actually are higher for people with higher needs, right? Because people with higher needs are using more services when they are actually experiencing homelessness out in the world. So one success story in the United States with Housing First in real time are veterans. So the Veteran Administration, this has been an initiative that was actually initiated under the Bush administration, and then it really built up traction during the Obama administration. And if you can go back. Oh, no worries. So there's been overwhelming success. So the VA, it's a federal agency. They have access to federal land. They have their own integrated hospital system. And so they've been able to just kind of overcome some policy barriers and basically build Housing First or permanent supportive housing on their own. But it works really, really well. And
I just have
thank you.
I just have a question about PSH. Is that public supportive housing?
Permanent supportive housing.
Okay.
Thank you. So it's known as permanent supportive housing or Housing First, and it really is just this intersection, the meeting of housing and these supportive medical services. And then the one thing I forgot to mention, so thank you for this clarifying point, is that what's it called? Permanent supportive housing. Yeah. So it's just right that we're not going to give it to people and then take it away. So they permanently have access to housing and these supportive medical services. And this was designed in New York City in the 1980s. And what they found is it is so successful because people don't have to complete behavioral prerequisites to receiving housing. So the previous approach, and it is still, widely used in different places across the country, is to say to someone who is, sleeping on the streets, experiencing chronic homelessness, I need you to get sober. I need you to get a job. I need you to do these different things before you receive housing, which, right, if we think about it, it's really, really challenging in practice. If you don't have a place to cook food, you don't have a place to go to the bathroom, you don't have a place to store your medication, to even start to think about how would you actually do that. But Housing First, permanent supportive housing, not only keeps people housed and keeps people off the streets, but it's cost savings because it gets people out of jail, it gets people out of the emergency rooms, and it actually improves their quality of life and their health outcomes too. So it's pretty cool. It's doing a lot of different things. And veteran homelessness is, I think, one of the biggest success stories about when this is implemented effectively. Veteran homelessness has ended in over 80 communities across the United States, and 3 states, like at the state level, which is the biggest reduction that we have had of any type of homelessness across the US. It's pretty.
When you say ended, definition meaning zero? Or?
So it's functional zeros.
Okay.
Yep, so it's basically at zero. You might have like one person coming into the system. A functional zero is there is space for everybody. And it's obviously, if veterans have been experiencing homelessness for like years or for decades, there might be 1 or 2 people who you're still building up trust to get them into a slot, but it's a functional zero. It's basically everybody has a spot, almost everybody is there.
Real quick, so on something like this, does this attract, if a community adopts this, does this attract like pull homeless people from other cities into?
So we haven't seen that. What happens more in regards to the movement around communities is less about people who are experiencing homelessness moving themselves and more about communities moving people around. So the data isn't great, but oftentimes, I will say, I think the one caveat is for rural areas. where, you might, if they're, like where a hospital is, right? So more people may come here because the hospital is here. So that's different. But otherwise, you actually see much more of communities, and this happens in California a lot, and in Texas, where cities will shift people to other cities via Greyhound or things like that. But people do tend to stay local. You don't really see much state-to-state movement. And so it's basically, generally like very regionally focused. Yeah, great question. Okay, so this is the policy part, and let me know if I forgot to keep time.
Don't,
I think we're good.
we have schedule, so take your time.
Awesome. So this is just a little bit about how all this actually operates. So we know what works. I can also talk about what doesn't work if you have questions about that. So in federal policy, the entities that are responsible for ending homelessness across the United States aren't actually cities or towns or local governments of any kind, which might seem kind of strange if you're not familiar with it. They are something known as the continuums of care. And the continuums of care are these entities that, again, they're federally designated. Most of the time, they're organized locally. Sometimes they're not, but I would say about 95% of the time, they're organized around municipalities, I'll just say. But they are non-governmental organizations. And so there's one lead agency that is kind of like the head of the continuum of care, and they receive federal money to basically know scope of homelessness in the community. So they're responsible for all of the data collection, and they're also responsible for designing and implementing policy solutions to homelessness. So they also coordinate between all of the social services and the shelters. They're in charge of doing everything. Now, the challenge comes that over 70% of the continuums of care are not a part of or don't have interactions with local government, which obviously, we're here in a local government body. You all know local government has the authority to do lots of different things. The continuums of care as non-governmental entities don't have the ability to do that. And so there are lots of things, whether it's building housing, working with the police department, you name it, that can basically constrain their ability to carry out policy tasks. And it really just depends on the locality and the relationship between the continuum of care and the local government or local governments. Again, because, so there are, of like the 50 largest cities in the United States, those ones, the continuum of care is organized in the same geographic boundary as the big city. So like San Francisco, Boston, New York City. For everybody else, you usually have one continuum of care that is responsible for multiple local jurisdictions. And sometimes you have one continuum of care that is responsible for many local jurisdictions. And so then you run into all these other issues, thinking about policy coordination, data, how do you keep track of who's actually experiencing homelessness, who's at risk, and then also conflicting policy approaches, right? Like if one locality is doing something different, the other one is doing something different, nobody's talking to each other, and then the COC is in the background, kind of waving from the stage. And this gets particularly relevant for smaller municipalities and rural areas, because most of these are represented by regional COCs or suburban rural COCs, which are generally many, sometimes 5 or more localities. So it gets complicated.
Is the one for, is it Tompkins County, what's the lead agency, I guess, that'd be relevant for?
Great question. So for Tompkins County is its own COC. For the surrounding counties, the reason why I'm bringing this up, so Cayuga, Elmira, Owego, I think they're, and I have it in a spreadsheet, I'm happy to share it with you. There are, I think, about 5 different COCs that interact with, or, you know, could interact very much with the Tompkins County COC, just if we're thinking about the surrounding rural areas. But yes, Tompkins County is its own COC, and so obviously that includes Lansing. So this I also wanted to flag as a policy opportunity. So the Veterans Administration, I'm going to get that as an example of why policy success. One other space that we haven't seen this is much newer than the VA initiatives, but there has been a lot of success and more movement regarding housing as healthcare. Permanent supportive housing, housing first, we're talking again about having housing, but these necessary social and medical services to keep people off the streets. And hospitals have started to get really interested in this and to, in some cases in cities, buy into this. And actually, because they have a vested interest, you know, in reducing the number of people who are in basically freeing up hospital beds, reducing space in emergency departments, and housing these high utilizers of multiple systems or people experiencing chronic homelessness is really beneficial to hospitals. There are examples from Chicago, from Oakland. There are lots of different places where hospitals are basically getting on board and saying like, hey, we'll give you some pilot money or we'll give you some long-term funding and we'll help communities set up housing, basically. The hospitals don't run the housing, but they have been big funders. And then they have also been partnering with Medicaid match funds through 1115 waivers, 1715 waivers. So there, I would think about this. And the big reason I wanted to bring this up, and Drew and I had a conversation about this, is this is already happening in Tompkins County. Cayuga Park is an initiative that is, it's ongoing, it's happening downtown by the lake, but Cayuga Medical Center has put up funding to build affordable housing. I'm not sure if they are building permanent supportive housing, but essentially the hospital is funding housing and they're funding a Medicaid office and other allied health offices. So, and it will all be in the same piece of infrastructure. So they're basically already funding local housing as healthcare. And I think this could be something that would definitely be worth considering, given the financial power of hospitals and access to different resources that they have. And it's been so successful in other communities when they have had this relationship with hospitals as an initial funder to kind of get this off the ground and to be able to, you know, build housing and this kind of complicated housing that requires, you know, supportive services more effectively. Yeah. And then the last thing I'll say, and I'll wrap up. Obviously, you know, if you haven't already, the Tompkins County COC is great. Liddy Barger is their director, and she's really fantastic. I'm sure she'd be happy to come in and chat with you all. She's really wonderful, but definitely thinking about the intergovernmental collaboration. So, you know, between the different local governments, what is Ithaca doing, what's Lansing doing, because you're all working with the same population, and the continuum of care is the one who holds the data and again is responsible for designing these solutions for the entire population that's experiencing homelessness in Tompkins County. And this can also just, if there are any conflicting policy approaches, it gets everybody on the same page, because this, you know, it does need a more coordinated approach. And then there's also opportunity to, as well, to think about intergovernmental coordination to potentially utilize or increase opportunities for funding through housing as healthcare, which I think is really exciting, because this is not happening in all places, and the fact that it's already happening here in Tompkins County, it seems like there's this opportunity is just sitting right here, right now. And then the last thing I wanted to say too is, so the COC obviously has a wealth of knowledge. You know, they know this population inside and out. They know who is experiencing chronic homelessness. They know who is experiencing temporary homelessness. They work with all the different social service providers. So they provide obviously critical expertise and critical representation for the system, but I would also definitely really emphasize getting representation from persons with lived experience, because as you're thinking about developing or designing policy approaches or policy initiatives, people who have actually experienced homelessness, whether it's temporary or chronic homelessness, all of this too, even though we know, the broad sweeps of what is effective, what is ineffective, it is still jurisdiction specific, and people who have gone through this or are going through it really know the ins and outs. And Jamila Mitchner, who's a colleague of mine at Cornell, she does a lot of work at integrating people who have lived experience into policy decision making, and it just makes policy work a lot better when you have people who can actually like give you the specifics and say, this was helpful, this wasn't super helpful. So thinking about the details of any of these approaches.
Thank you so much, yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I know that was a fast sweep through your knowledge, but it's basically, we wanted an introductory conversation. I know that there are things going on in the county, so I'll allow the trustees, if they have any questions, to speak up.
Yeah, I'd be interested in just hearing a little bit more about Cayuga Park, the background. How did that initiative take, was it just the COC and the hospital or the medical center that just kind of brought together? Was Ithaca government involved, Falcons government, Holmes County government?
So this is an excellent question, and I have actually been trying to get this information, and I am not sure. I know that this was mostly hospital initiated. This is something that, so the hospital is Cayuga Medical Center is very concerned about these high utilizers. And so they initiated it. I know there's also obviously a conversation with Tompkins County. I do not know the extent to which the COC is involved. But from what I understand, Cayuga Medical Center was the primary mover. But I am trying to get more information about this.
It's kind of crazy because it just doesn't seem at all to me like the hospital is doing anything altruistic here. No. It's only specifically like they take all of our money because they charge way too much, and then they're this entity that can suddenly fund things, and then they build these houses that will then support people that will be their exclusive patients, that they'll just like continue to take money from the federal government. It seems like Star Wars level evil.
Yeah, and I do not know the specific policy context that's going on here. And the one thing that I will say is, right, this is a huge debate in the whole hospitals getting involved, right? Because what does it mean? And the question that I always ask is, would you want your hospital as your landlord? That's, it's like, and what does it mean to have your hospital be your landlord? And so I think in the majority of the cases, the hospitals they're putting up the funding, but they're not functionally the landlord, but it's still a really important question, right? What is their intent, what's actually going on? And what does it mean for privacy and other things? And I don't have the details in this case, but it's definitely a really important part of the discussion. And I think it's like a case-by-case specific basis. In the Bay Area, one of the reasons why hospitals are getting involved is because there hasn't been any movement for decades. And I think, so they're basically like, we're gonna step in because nothing else is happening, but this is obviously very different, dependent, for each local community. But yeah, thank you.
What are the micro solutions? These are like the macro solutions. Mm-hmm. What do you, just when you have a transient homeless population that's not serving themselves in an encampment, what do you do?
So, can you specify a little bit more? Do you mean like on?
That's the chronic homeless person who is maybe not producing for the environment, that maybe they're panhandling, maybe they're doing a lot of theft, maybe they're just kind of being aggressive. So what are the solutions that work in those cases?
So that is Housing First. So Housing First, and you can look at it at the macro level, say we're talking about the Veterans Administration, or you can look at it at the individual kind of like pilot study level. And what we found is, so people in these circumstances, 99% of people are not choosing to be homeless. And so when you see people experiencing chronic homelessness, again, these are folks who have like, a physical medical condition. And then at the same time, most of them, especially veterans, right, with PTSD, people with bipolar, and this is all untreated, right? So you have untreated severe mental illness, and then oftentimes people end up adopting a substance use disorder as a coping mechanism. And this actually happened a lot during COVID, where people were experiencing unsheltered homelessness for the first time. It's much easier to get through the night, if you are using, because it's cold, you're suffering, it's really stressful. So that's how people end up in these situations. And it does take, on an individual basis, it takes a lot of trust, because most of the folks that you see, they've been on the streets for so long.
So what is the process? Housing First is a concept. It's not a bed with a doctor and a key, like.
Oh, yep, that's absolutely what it is. Yep.
Where is this here?
Yeah, so.
Where, literally, I'm asking, where is this here?
So I don't know if we have units of Housing First in Tompkins County.
Yes, we do.
Oh, we do? Oh,
Well, there's a group, because we had a presentation at a foundation that I'm on the board of,
awesome.
that is pulling together money to do house construction with the Housing First.
So we will,
Yeah,
Where will
I mean, it's starting,
so it's coming.
that be located, just out of curiosity?
unclear yet, so, as far as I know. And then there was the group down in Newfield, which I think.
Second Wind.
Second Wind cottages. That's somewhat the same. I think they provide services with the housing for those men. So it's a little bit, it's getting some traction outside of the hospital context.
And, sorry. It's interesting because I see some of these things at the macro level, like Salt Lake City we were talking about, or Boulder, and, they have these numbers that you're talking about police and emergency and hospital beds and all that. You can, just by giving Housing First, the cost is like a third. But it's always like, so why doesn't this get implemented? And you have this, someone pays who's paying what, and who are they getting the benefits for that? So even if you're macro-wide getting the cost benefits, a reduction in costs, it's not always going to the people who would maybe be putting up with the costs of being built here, or putting up, kind of dealing with the extra outlay of cash, and the costs go to savings for the hospital or go to savings for the police department, but that doesn't flow always to the same government, right? So I guess a lot of it is that's why I was curious about Cayuga Park, which, how does that kind of come together, and can it be expanded? And then I guess it sounds like just the temporary, bit more like affordable housing would have to be created, that would have to be also kind of working with other governments to make sure that it's not, you kind of have access across the county, because it sounds like that's overlapping with the continuum of care.
Exactly. So, right. So the continuum of care, is representing the county, but obviously you have different governments within that. And so, yes, the question of who's paying for this is one of the primary reasons why this doesn't get implemented. Also misconceptions about, if people are choosing this, so we don't want to help them. I think the reality that's important to keep in mind is that the longer people, basically the only solution that works, and we know this overwhelmingly, is for people experiencing chronic homelessness, not temporary, is Housing First. If you just house people, but you don't have medical necessities there, people will basically end up experiencing homelessness again, because they have these really intense medical needs. So it does work, but it's hard to do. We've seen sites fail in New York City as a result of this. And so, yes, so Cayuga Park is an interesting thing. Basically, if you can offset the initial costs to someone else, but the whole community benefits, because it ends up being otherwise this kind of negative externality, which are people's lives, right? Where we're all experiencing homelessness, or we're not obviously ourselves, but we're all experiencing the realities, right? It's not fun for people to see people experiencing homelessness in the community. It's not fun for the people who are actually experiencing homelessness. So that's the tough spot. Is it definitely becomes a collective action problem. Who's going to act? But when you can do it, and do it correctly, it does work really, really well. I do some work with Sunflower Houses, which is a housing program in Ithaca, and they have the first part of it. They have the housing part, but they don't have the necessary supportive services. And so they've had a hard time basically trying to kind of pre-screen people who are doing okay enough that they don't need these other services. They're also actually trying to become housing first going forward because of just the overwhelming amount of these complex needs.
How many people would be there?
So right now there are 12, but they're on 9-month leases, and everybody's employed. So these are, and it's specifically for people who are re-entering from jail. And it's really effective for the people who don't have these complex conditions. Basically for people who have been incarcerated, but they haven't been experiencing cycles of homelessness, so they have fewer physical needs and behavioral health needs.
To get to the zero of the way you defined it before, how many beds or rooms or apartments would we need in Ithaca, in Thomas County?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I have the data, and I can also tell you where to get the data. I can open it up.
Just roughly, it's fine.
Yes, so they would be the number of people who are experiencing chronic homelessness. This is just from the point in time count. Oops. Okay. I just have to go to the.
And then I'm just curious, the follow-up question is going to be, then how many social workers is that? How many doctors is that? How many professionals is that?
Yep, so that I don't have the answer to, but this is where it gets tough, right? Because you want to make sure you do it right, otherwise it doesn't work. And there's a really, really, really great handbook. This is where the continuum of care is necessary. They have the necessary expertise to basically tell you, this is what we need, this is how many of these different staff members and types, of workers that you would need. But there's this really great handbook from the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine on permanent supportive housing. It's publicly available, it's all online, and they break down the evidence for all of this, for all of these different models, what works best, what are the trade-offs, do you have group housing, do you have individual units, how many social workers, how often do you have people come and visit? It also is, will be a little bit different depending on people's needs. If you have people who have been experiencing homelessness for longer, they're usually much sicker, they're older, so they obviously have more complex needs than maybe people who have been experiencing chronic homelessness for a couple of years. But yeah.
What does work best?
Pardon?
What does work best? Group versus individual?
Chicago will tell you that individual works best, but you have to have some kind of group element built into it, because otherwise people get lonely, and then basically there's a better adherence to these supportive services when people aren't totally isolated.
Yeah.
Yep, which makes sense. And I'm happy to share the data with you about the numbers. It looks like there's 144 people who are experiencing sheltered homelessness in Hawkins County, but I don't have, it's a big spreadsheet, so I can, and it's all publicly available data from the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and you can look at those numbers by category of homelessness, and then you can also look at it for the surrounding counties.
Would you mind sending us links to this information and also a link to the handbook you mentioned?
Yep,
I
absolutely.
think that would be valuable to have.
Yep.
Thank you.
Peter, what's the name of the,
I just found it in my email. It was Liddy Barger and Simone Gatson from Home Together talking.
From Home Together?
And I can forward their presentation to the foundation. it was very interesting, and I think they do have numbers in here for Tompkins, so I have to look at it.
And Lydia Barger is the director of the.
Yeah.
Tompkins Care.
Yeah,
Okay, thank you.
she's wonderful.
That's great.
Are there other questions?
Just really quick, then also thinking about what you could do with this. So it sounds like the incentives work best for the hospital, reducing costs, they get some matching funding. It's in their economic incentive they're lined up to do this. And then, so as far as working with across municipalities, so they'd be on board, the hospital would be on board to do this. But as far as how to compensate or how to cooperate with other governments, any things that have worked best when you're kind of, because it's being built in this, someone's benefiting from it being built there, and someone's being, how do you kind of coordinate that, or how do you kind of go about cooperating? Playing nice, but also getting a deal that works for everybody. Yeah.
I mean, obviously, that's always context dependent. Where we see it work best is where everyone is communicating. And this is also where it's necessary for the COC to be involved with everyone, because the COC has all of the data. They are the gatekeepers of these counts. So the data that I'm looking at, this is the continuum of care's data for Tompkins County. And what will happen sometimes is actually, this was a big issue in Atlanta with surrounding counties and jurisdictions where some counties didn't want to participate in the deliberations. And then the continuum of care is trying to coordinate, we have folks in this jurisdiction who are experiencing homelessness, but we can't actually get them access to resources. So it's hard, right? It's necessarily a hard problem. There's also the reality too of, depending on the setup of the municipality, where different services are located, right? Folks, especially folks who are experiencing chronic homelessness, don't have access to vehicles, even people who are experiencing temporary homelessness. So for an example with sunflower houses, all of these people are employed, right? Like they're working, they're participating in the economy, but they don't all necessarily have a car. So thinking about where do you locate things to make sure that people can be successful? And that's a difficult conversation because obviously, not every place has, like the bus is downtown, right? The transportation center. So I think it's being open to having these conversations and then also knowing too that everybody has to be on board in order to solve this because, right, if we do have other approaches that don't work, like policing criminalization of homelessness, if we just incarcerate people, it doesn't actually end homelessness. It might reduce visibility for a short period of time, but it actually, data overwhelmingly shows that it proliferates cycles of homelessness.
It's expensive too.
And it's super expensive, yes, exactly. It doesn't work, it's expensive. So it's trying to think about, these aren't fun conversations, but if you can get everybody on board, that's usually when it works best. There's always, going to be some conflict, but at least getting everybody in the room. And then getting the COC in the room and then asking them, who are they in contact with, who hasn't been at the table, they usually will have the best information on that.
So has San Francisco had any positive movement in the last 2 years?
So San Francisco has-ish. I do a lot of work there, and it's tough. It's really tough, and it's mostly tough because of the zoning ordinances, where so housing in general is a big issue in San Francisco. But due to hospital involvement, and then also this, I don't know if anyone's heard of Project Room Key. This was basically the state of California bought up some vacant motels and turned them into housing first units. So there were folks who had been experiencing chronic homelessness for decades who got housing for the first time in decades and have remained stably housed. It's a small number of people, but it is, I think it was about a 10% reduction in chronic homelessness, which is really outstanding for them. They have a long ways to go, but yeah.
How long has that been going on? That program, how long has it been going?
Oh, Project Room Key? That was just started during the pandemic.
Okay, so it's a couple of years now. Well, that's not a bad return for just 10 years. 2 years, yeah.
Yeah, they had actually, Project Room Key was really, really cool, and they have housed thousands of people across the state. But then, as the pandemic regulations were rolled back, a lot of people were actually removed from the hotels. A lot of the hotels were closed, and so people were sent back out on the streets.
Any other questions? I have a couple. Within Tompkins County, within our environment, where does most of the funding come from the NGOs? Is it federal or state?
Ooh, so New York definitely has more state funding than other places, but most of this is federal.
Okay, so it would be like a federal grant, and then New York State would be a supplement to that.
Yeah.
Okay, and do you know if the federal and state grants are hybrid? In other words, do they support each other, or are they two different streams and they get pumped in, and so they don't coordinate to see if the money's used for the best, most benefit?
It's almost always separate.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's normal. I was hoping maybe there might be a change, but,
There may, so I'm pretty new to New York State, so there may be some new programs that I'm unaware of, but it's generally quite separate. The federal dollars are through the Department of Housing and Urban Development Continuum of Care program.
Okay.
That's what the funds are called, and you can look at, it's all publicly available. You can actually find Tompkins County COC's annual action plan up online, and it'll tell you all the money that they get, what they're spending it for. Yeah.
all right. I'm trying to think, and I'm not familiar if, I know that Tompkins County at times does work with our surrounding counties, but I'm not absolutely certain that they do. I would be surprised if they don't at least communicate, that working with might be an extra step that's not there yet. Let's see, trying to think. Got that answered. I think, not a question, but a comment. Tompkins County and the Ithaca area has an extreme housing shortage. I mean, I feel that's probably something that's pretty common throughout most of the larger suburban areas. So it's very hard to find housing for working families.
Yep.
And I don't know how that's going to eat into support for permanent supportive housing. I know that the county and the city of Ithaca are sort of working on this, hit and miss. They would like to do this, but then you've got the problem of where. And it is one of those NIMBYisms, with not here, not here, not here. It's got to be somewhere. So there's got to be a cultural change at some point. And there's no solution. We're not going to come to a solution tonight, and I don't expect you to solve. If you solve it, you'll be farther along in your professional career. The other thing that I was thinking of this afternoon when we were talking, my wife and I, who's a county legislator, we were talking about the number of commercial properties that are going under. And I'm hoping that at some point it would be like the room key, where a state and or federal agency says, oh, let's step in and buy this building, make a permanent supportive housing there, because if it's like in a hotel or if it's in a commercial property, they can coordinate public transportation into one spot that picks up many people. It's not a route, it's a stop. So hopefully there'll be some solutions down the road. Do you know of anyone anywhere that might be trying to do something like that?
Yeah, so there are a couple of different things that you mentioned that I think are important to flag and to keep in mind. So absolutely, the location matters, particularly because of the where are we putting these resources, how are people getting to these resources? But the other part, which gets to the NIMBY challenges, is when you do concentrate people, whether it's public housing, affordable housing, permanent supportive housing, those sites don't do as well. The sites that are the most effective are the ones that are integrated or dispersed. And there's a program in Massachusetts called Massachusetts 40B, which is specifically it works to desegregate communities. And it's incredibly effective. And so you have communities, communities of color that are moving to predominantly white areas, and then they're experiencing, resource benefits, from being in an economically mobile community, and then they end up having, greater wealth. So those programs like that, where you're not just like putting everybody in one spot, are more successful. Chicago also, for their permanent supportive housing, that someone was asking about individual versus group. These individual rooms, but the sites are located around the city, different neighborhoods too. And yeah, I think the one thing here though is obviously it's a smaller place, right? Like, we're not a huge city, so there's just not as many places to put people. But I just wanted to flag that.
Oh, yeah, thank you. That's an interesting point. So people would rather have their own space rather than a shared space, and obviously shared spaces can cause problems, as it normally does anywhere, in a normal life. Okay, all right, thank you, interesting. Were there any other questions or comments?
I just want to ask what you are seeing is going to impact on all these wonderful plans as the pandemic funds run out. Medicaid is being cut off, et cetera, which is a real alarm bells, especially for more regional hospitals, for example.
Yes, it's a huge issue. So Medicaid was kind of touted as this silver bullet for people experiencing chronic homelessness when the Medicaid expansion first went through. So, these are, I should have mentioned, most people experiencing chronic homelessness are single adults. So they're not in families, they've been in this state of homelessness for a really long time, and they're mostly by themselves. And again, if we think about veterans as an example of this, but so when this group got access to Medicaid expansion, it did notably increase access to medical services, not housing, but people were getting medical care that they couldn't for really, basically for forever before that, and that was really important. Now, the one thing that was not solved, so obviously Medicaid is geographic specific, it's generally tied to your county Medicaid office, and some of these other approaches, so almost all communities do criminalize behaviors associated with homelessness. And so, and or participating in encampment clearances, when people are moved out of county areas, out of jurisdictional boundaries, they lose their Medicaid. Or they have, they can't use it. If they're incarcerated, they get rolled off Medicaid, they have to get re-enrolled. But during the COVID-19, people, no one was kicked off of Medicaid. People got to keep their Medicaid. And so there were all of these enrollment issues that people didn't have to worry about. And I think we're going to see a lot of challenges for a lot of people, obviously, not just including people experiencing homelessness. But yeah, it's a big question, and it's a really, really important question.
I didn't hear you mention drug addiction.
Oh, yeah, so substance use, that's what I was referring to. Yep. Do you have any specific questions about that?
Certainly that has a very large impact on permanent homelessness.
Yes.
It's also coupled to a lot of theft, and that involves the police departments, et cetera, et cetera. And that's actually a fairly large problem in terms of total cost to society. There was a thing on the news not last night, that this gang of three had $300,000 worth of tools that they'd stolen from places like Home Depot, et cetera. So it's that kind of thing. And that's one of the concerns that we have here locally with some of the merchants are quite concerned about that in terms of the people that we have around that are homeless.
Yeah, absolutely. So just thinking about substance use or addiction and crime. So actually, overwhelmingly, the majority of people who are experiencing homelessness and, experiencing chronic homelessness, who do have addiction disorders, they are not involved in crime like we would think of, thefts, things like this. Obviously there are a minority of people who will get involved in this behavior. We actually usually see that among people who are using substances but who are housed. So people experiencing homelessness, there's this other element where people will be, the most common reason that they're arrested are for what we call quality of life infractions. And so that is where, and we've seen a growth in laws that specifically target quality of life behaviors that are associated with homelessness. That's everything from sitting down in public, eating in public, urination and defecation, right? If you don't have a place to go to the bathroom, that's a real thing. Also fines and fees. If people will get fined for vacant property, things like this, and people can't pay those fines, so then they get arrested. So that is overwhelmingly the primary reason why you have law enforcement interactions. The other one is actually resident complaints. And I'm doing a lot of work on this. We see across the country, people, obviously it's scary, it can be concerning if you don't know what's going on, to see people, experience in these really horrible states, right? And so we see residents who are housed, call the police and say, I don't know what's going on, but please remove these folks from my area. And then it proliferates these cycles of interactions between people who are experiencing chronic homelessness and police departments. And this is also obviously related to illicit drug use. This is a big thing that's happening in San Francisco, where we have visible injection drug use, again, just as basically a coping mechanism for, if I had, was experiencing homelessness, sleeping on the streets, I guarantee you I would have, an addiction disorder, right? And just to think about how do you get through that? But so this is where we have these cycles of justice involvement with people experiencing homelessness, but it's generally just for survival as opposed to other things that we would think as typical criminal behavior. Great.
Do you have any statistics on the percentage of homeless people who are involved in criminal acts? Is there any kind of a measure on that?
So again, I would say that the measure would be skewed because, everyone, if you're experiencing chronic homelessness, you will have some kind of law enforcement citation or violation just from being homeless.
Right.
And so, but then, you think about the proportion of people who are actually committing violent crimes.
Burglary, robbery,
Yeah,
et cetera.
that's very low. And there is a lot of research, and I'm happy to pull this and share it with you, on the relationship between severe mental illness and addiction disorders and crime. That is also very low. So, I know there's a lot of discussion, right, that people with psychotic disorders are more likely to commit crimes. That's not true. Or are more likely to be violent. That's not true. We do obviously see a lot of issues with police interactions with people who are experiencing psychotic events. That can obviously, trigger violent encounter if it's not handled well. And that's usually more of a police training issue and de-escalation as opposed to the person themselves. So it's really complicated, but it's a really, really good question. And the other point that I meant to mention is when we do see Housing First implemented effectively, it also does, and it reduces criminal interactions, right? It reduces police interactions, so across the board, all of that, it drops substantially.
One of the things that goes with this, it takes a lot of person power to actually carry it out.
Yes.
So it's a trade between person power for enforcing the law and person power changing this. So, in my daytime job, I have trouble finding people to do things, so.
Yep. Yeah. And one thing, so I talked to a lot of police departments across the country about this, and it's a real challenge, right? It's like, I think police officers sometimes feel really conflicted about this. It's like, do I really want to be having the 100th interaction with this person to kind of remove them from this space? Or I know you just really need to get to your medical appointment, but I can't do anything, and, you know, someone's calling me, here I am, whereas I could actually be, you know, helping to solve these other, you know, criminal cases or things like that, yeah.
Right.
You know about the specific, like, regular panhandlers in Ithaca, if they are chronic homelessness people or homed?
I don't know about Ithaca specifically, but I do know that, so a lot of people, again, who, basically the longer you've been homeless, people will end up resorting to panhandling, because it's, you know, it's just these cycles. If you've been in and out of jail for these quality of life crimes, a lot of people end up giving up on the system. They're just kind of like, you know, there's not much I can do, but I don't know. I will say it's very, some communities, you know, will have like one person who is exploiting the system, but overall, it is very rare for people who are panhandling to be housed and doing this deceptively.
Well, I didn't think they were deceiving anyone, I was just wondering
Yeah.
if they were chronic homeless
Oh, if
or,
they're, yes, they
or
would
just
be.
otherwise housed, you know, with mental,
Oh,
you know.
yes, yeah, it's almost always people experiencing chronic homelessness, yeah.
So it sounds like cooperate across governments, build affordable housing, housing first, with supportive housing with hospital on board.
a shit ton of social
Easy.
workers.
Super easy.
Super easy, yeah.
Super easy. Yeah, no, it's really, right, like all of this, getting all these pieces.
Just getting
on-
people to work together really is the question.
Yeah, exactly.
And
That
getting
is-
people to let, it's all the other issues about compensating some of those, where you build it and how you do that, yeah.
Yeah, it's really just getting, I would say step one is just getting everybody in the room. And that's what usually doesn't happen. Most communities, everybody's not in the room. And, you know, this is across big cities, small cities, but we do have, you know, this is the nature of the way that the system was established, which, you know, just builds in these challenges. You have the COC over there. Most local governments don't know about the COC. Most mayors don't know about the COCs. And so they don't even know, do we have a data system? So I think just getting everybody at the table is step number one. And the COC will be able to give you so many more details than I can, you know, like you can say about what's going on with specific types of housing, what are the needs of all the different populations. And they know too, they will be able to tell you, like, you know, this person who panhandles here, like, we know them and we've been working with them for 7 years, you know, they know everybody, they have a rolling list, and are basically, they're responsible for designing these programs and for matching people to services. Their constraint is, where do we get the services? How do we actually do that?
So on Cayuga Park, it sounds like you kind of, how do you untangle this? First you'd start with COC and maybe the hospital.
Yeah.
But at Cayuga Park, as an example, and then how did Ithaca even, Ithaca must have, the zoning board must have allowed that to be
Yes.
built there. So
Yeah, clearly there's some collaboration.
obviously, we have to collaborate countywide as far as where it would be, even though these
Yeah.
things are expanded or whatever. But those are the bases that maybe have that, the background on that, people, COC and the hospital obviously would be a good place to start anyway.
Absolutely. And I think especially, right, because you know, obviously, the hospital's already put up money to do this. And so as far as like fast solutions, I know, nothing is fast,
No.
but a faster solution.
Faster, at least progress.
In this, yes, exactly, at least progress. Most places, besides, you know, VA aside, putting the veterans aside, they're the only ones that can do it a little bit faster, but hospitals are the ones who have been able to act the fastest, which is,
Zoning
you know,
different, because zoning, the VA can do things without getting.
yeah, the VA doesn't have to worry about zoning, and then hospitals, it's easier to zone for healthcare facilities than it is, you know, in different communities. It seems to be less of an issue in Tompkins County, but, you know, still a challenge. It's easier to zone for healthcare facilities than it is for different types of housing, especially if we're thinking about places that are zoned for single-family housing. Anyway, so hospitals can get around things, and hospitals have access to more money. And so this is why cities have started going this route, because they're like, we just haven't seen traction. So we're gonna, or in many cases, it is the hospital initiating that we're seeing. The healthcare system is like, we need to free up our beds, basically.
Yeah, it's good for them,
Yeah, it's good for them.
yeah.
And I think that also it's probably the fact that hospitals have dealt with many of the problems that are homeless. So they know what to expect.
Absolutely.
And they have models that they can, this is what needs to be done. So they're like 3 or 4 steps ahead of everyone else.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. If you talk to any hospital system, any emergency department, start with the emergency department, right? They will have, obviously they won't disclose the list of names for HIPAA reasons, but, they know, they're like, these are the folks who come in every night. They don't need to be here. They have these chronic, so the medical problems that folks who experience long-term homelessness have, it's like heart disease, diabetes. So they're not emergencies, but they're these persistent medical problems that require treatment. And then they do have persistent behavioral health problems, which that can result obviously in psychiatric emergencies. But essentially the emergency department is like, this is not the place for you to be. You just don't have anywhere else to go. And so, and they see people over years moving in and out of these services. They have relationships with the police department who will bring these folks to the hospital. So yeah, the hospitals know, and they know how to deal with it. And they, obviously have access to all the staff, to be able to set up the supportive part of permanent supportive housing.
I'm reading an article right now on Cayuga Park, and honestly, if I didn't just hear this, I would not have known to read between the lines as to what they were actually saying when they were talking about.
It wasn't well communicated at all.
I know what it says now that I know what it says, but otherwise I would not know what it says.
Yeah. And this is why I don't know more about it, because I was unaware, and someone mentioned it, and I was like, no way, and then did some digging, but yes.
So the hospital could kind of even, or they could have a medical facility, use some of their medical space and just do that without really.
Yep.
Permanent has a sort of permanent sound to it. How many, what's the rate or the success of moving people from supportive housing into a regular housing environment? Would you say, how does that work?
It's such an important point. I'm really glad you asked about that. So obviously it depends on the risk. So the way that continuums of care do this, basically prioritize people for access to services, is a vulnerability index. And so what they do is they pair how long people have been experiencing homelessness. So because the longer, just greater risks build up over time. So they do duration paired with health needs. And the people who are at the high end of the spectrum on both of those people might not ever be able to leave supportive housing, just because their needs are so high. And so these are people who have, really complicated chronic medical conditions, along with more intense psychiatric needs. Not to say that they can't, right? But they will basically need medical support for the long term. They might be able to transition out of permanent supportive housing, and the VA has some data on that. But for the people at the first end of the spectrum, where maybe they have been experiencing chronic homelessness for a shorter duration, their medical needs aren't as complicated, and they have more treatable, so maybe not severe mental illness, but maybe like depression, more functional behavioral health disorders. Those folks can absolutely transition out, and it's just a case-by-case basis, on like how long. But San Francisco, so they had in the 1990s, so actually basically as in a response to the AIDS epidemic, they built a whole lot of supported housing and SRO units that housed people for a really long time, and they did it really well. And a lot of those people are like ready to move out. Basically, they have people that they would want to give these units to, but there's no place for them to go. So they have to stay there, and it's just bottlenecking the system. But yes, people can absolutely transition out. And I think the great thing too is for the people at the other end of the spectrum whose needs aren't as intense, they can basically come back, as contributing, they can participate in society, right? It improves educational outcomes, it improves employment, it improves economic investment. There's a whole host of things that it's pretty incredible.
Anything else? Dr. Wilson, thank you. This was a good opening salvo of our conversations. So please send us the links. And if something comes up that you think might be of interest to our village, please pass it along. You know, this is a conversation that's going to happen between these entities. You might want to represent, let us know.
Absolutely.
And we'll just continue on and gather more information and see if we can help, or at least become more informed.
Great. Yeah, well, thank you so much. Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure to meet all of you. I'm sorry I was, facing away. But yeah, and thank you for your work on this issue. I'll send you the materials. If there's anything else that you have questions about that you would like more information on, I will share it with you. Because there's a whole lot of data out there. Just let me know what you need.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you
so much.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yes, absolutely. It's great to meet you.
Okay. Lots to think about. The next topic is mayor's comments. I really don't have any specific comments tonight. Just a reminder that 1 week from tomorrow, we have our village election from noon to 9 PM, and the voting will take place over in the community room. So be sure and vote. Good night.
Thank you so much.
So we'll go around the table. Carolyn, do you have anything for tonight?
I already told Drew, but I'll tell you guys. Today is Kego Heights garbage pickup.
So did you carry yourself over?
No, I drove through it, I looked around, and I saw the truck.
So it does happen somewhere, right?
I should have pulled over and asked those truck, actually. Some of the logistics, they would know the information. They probably know more about it than anybody else I could call. Anyway, no, I don't have anything.
This is the Cayuga Heights, this is their day.
It's their day.
Researching, you're the committee.
We'll have
I
to,
just keep talking about it, I always forget when I'm not sitting right here.
we'll have to talk about coordinate next time.
Anything else, Carolyn? Drew?
I can't think of anything since the last meeting that I went to be honest, so yeah, I'll pass.
Okay. I'll save you for last. Susan?
Just Joint Commission and Youth Services are actually moving spaces, and they're getting settled, and they're hiring people. So it sounds like those services are coming back up to speed to where they were, perhaps, and looking at funding opportunities, really paying attention to what's going on in Albany and the rest of the world in terms of making their numbers whatever they are, but still a lot of reorganization and shifting and getting to know one another and communicating back and forth.
I know that there is a subset of homelessness that involves runaway youth.
Yep.
Who are below 18.
Yes, and that's difficult.
That's a national problem too, and.
Yeah, so it all,
So that they're focusing on,
figuring it out.
are they going to be co-located in the same location then? Or is it just a matter of shifting to?
They're all downtown, but the old Immaculate Conception seems to be where youth services have moved into the basement, and
Okay,
there was some chat about living spaces, in the upper levels, and I don't know what that's all about at this point. It's still a learning curve for me, for those organizations and the people and the coming and the going.
keep us informed when it's set up. At some point, they might think about having them come in and tell us about their new location and what they're.
Yes, as new people come on board, and I know they're happy to talk to us. I think they've come to us in the past.
Yes, they have, so, yeah.
But with new people on board, I will certainly make it known that we would love to have them
Thanks, Susan.
present. And Cuba Watershed has a couple of opportunities this month. One, an on-site meeting on campus, and the other is grant writing. So that whole website is huge.
They finished their hiring?
Yes, the grant writing person, that was a year, last fall.
Who did they hire?
Someone that everybody approved of, and right now, these Zoom meetings, it's difficult, because I don't get so I can't name her.
Have they, what have they pursued since coming on board?
Still ditches, whatever federal monies are there, looking at,
Have they had any success?
I think they're still in the process of determining and gathering data. They have just huge, I think the biggest plus for them was their website finally coming on board, where everybody has access to. You could spend all week, you could spend all year. So there's lots of data, which will support the grant writing eventually. So the watershed. And it's also getting municipalities on board to participate. So struggles, it feels like everybody's struggling for monies and for participation, and hopefully moving forward, see progress.
Okay. Appreciate it, Susan. Pat, this is your last meeting. What would you like to say?
Much. I think I put it in the newsletter and I said my goodbyes, sort of. But just one thing if you can let John know that the deer sign on Oakcrest is on the floor.
He's on.
Oh, did you hear that, John? My last comment for you.
He's muted.
That might be, it's been down now for a while. It's coming up from Cayuga Heights, it's on the right-hand side, it's about 50 yards in. If you're coming down, it's on the left-hand side. But it looks tacky.
That's a deer warning sign, beware of deer.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's an important sign. When you come.
Yeah.
Well, I can't express to you how sad I am to see you leave the Board of Trustees.
Thank you.
Been here since I've been here, and I've always worked very well with our village, done so much for us. It's not gonna be the same without you.
Well, thank you.
But I wish you and Tom lots of travels. So let us know where you go and what you see, so.
Well, there's the young man that brought me on under protest.
Don, do you have anything to say?
Yes, thank you, Pat.
Thanks,
It's
Don.
been a great opportunity, let's put it that way. I think Jody's going to miss you a great deal,
Yeah, I'm gonna,
because Pat keeps track, make sure she hasn't made any mistakes in the book.
that's right. Well, I still have one more left to do. The next couple of days,
Drop one in.
and then someone else can take it over.
See the defect.
She doesn't make too many mistakes.
Too many, I didn't know you made any.
No, it's perfect.
Hides them like Easter eggs here. Look out for fun, yeah.
So Pat,
It's been a long myself.
we have decided to present you a gift,
Oh
a
dear.
parting gift.
Should I really open this box?
Yes.
Yes, you must open it.
Okay. Oh. Oh, that's nice. An appreciation to Patricia O'Rourke for her service as village trustee, 2010 to 2023. Oh, that's a sign. That's pretty nice, thank you.
This was made by Jerry Monahan,
Oh,
a
really?
local artist.
Well, he served with me on the board for a while.
Turn it around.
Yep.
You turn it around.
Great, actually.
Oh, that's nice.
Yeah, great.
Don't you like my name up there on the board?
Yeah. And
It's there permanently.
stand in there for it.
Oh, come to the stand, that's nice.
That's the least we could do for everything you've done for our village.
Thank you.
I-
No, it's been a pleasure working with everybody. It's time to move on, and you're getting some good new blood, and it helps. But you said there's a stand?
Yeah.
Oh, I think my husband would like to see that. Get his Monday nights back. Oh, no, you'll lose these Monday nights.
Yeah. Now, there will be honeydew lists, right? Monday night honeydew lists.
Yeah, well, Don will know that. You know what professors are like at Cornell.
Yeah, my father-in-law got me this round coin that has a to it on it. And he goes, that way, whenever you say, I'll get around to it, you already have it. It's around to it, yeah.
No, it's been a long run, but it's been fun. As I say, I've been with Cody right from the beginning, and Don, and, well, you're all sort of new, but not really new, but, and you came on board, so, yeah.
Yeah, it's been a wild ride.
Peter's been around. He said, we've had a few changes in the, you're sort of with the lawyers, but they've all been nice, so it's been nice, and, I'll still be around, I'll still come in with comments. You know me, I like to keep John, if he's listening, on his toes. Ever since he cut those bushes down. I'm looking at Nova Stereo outside now. Well, it wasn't John, they put it out there, but they just got happy with chopping all the bushes down, but.
Just got crazy with the chopping, right?
But they learned their lesson, they don't come near me anymore. It's too late.
Where the wisteria?
Then, so, it was a few years ago now, you remember, Don? They got really happy, I mean, and they took all this wisteria, and I notice them now, everybody's got lovely yellow. Mine are gone. Anyhow.
Yeah, they've mentioned that they're very careful around your property, so I think they have learned their lesson.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Pat.
Oh, thank you. It's been a pleasure to serve. It's just that, time to retire, getting old.
Understand. Oh, frees up time so you can do
No,
more
it's
fun
really,
things.
it's the traveling now, I can get to see my daughter and spend more time with her.
Got a wedding to plan. Got a wedding to help plan.
Yeah, got that too, yeah, so I'll be, so that, it's always been difficult when she says, oh, come for a month, but then I have meetings and that, I mean, with Zoom, it was easier, but even so, it's still hard when you're on the road.
It is hard.
Where's your daughter? Where's your daughter?
It's out in Seattle.
Oh, yeah, that's far, yeah.
So I'll get to see a little bit more of her now, which is nice.
It's good.
What's that?
Is that what you motion to?
Oh. So I'll put forward a motion to adjourn.
Who will second that?
I will second that. Well done, Pat.
Pat closes the rest.
That's right.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye, at 9:05. I've been known to do much earlier. I think I have the record for closing the earliest meetings.